So this is October 31st, 2008, and it's a Pathwork teleconference on Pathwork Lecture 201, Demagnetizing Negative Force Fields. And where I thought I would start is what we were chatting about a bit before, and that is that sometimes the lectures can seem deceptively simple. Sometimes logically they're so clear that you wonder, but where's the work? You know, now what do I do? One of the things that I have found in the Pathwork lectures is that there is an extraordinary shift in paradigm in how the lectures present reality. So the guide presents reality as being larger than human comprehension. So we have part of the story, we have mirrors to the story, we have allegory, we have as in heaven so below, as below so above. So we have clues and hints, but to some extent what the guide is saying is that we may do the equivalent of only seeing in black and white when the reality is color. So we see extraordinary shades of black and of gray. But in the spirit world, there's such an exponential increase in reality, in dimension, in depth, that we need to take our reality with a grain of salt. We need to take our reality lightly and not presume that it is everything. But there's a place where human beings do presume that what they see and hear is everything. Okay? So, for instance, the guide talks about, we talked a while back about dreams, imagination, and the guide says that in the spirit world there are a multitude of dimensions. Let's pick a figure of 20 just for the sake of argument. Let's say in the spirit world there are 20 different dimensions, whereas here there are 4, maybe 5 dimensions that we can work within. If we go into spirit in our imagination or our dreams, or if we are able to contact spirit, when we try to bring that information back, it's in effect we have to translate from a 20-dimensional world back into a 5-dimensional world. And in that translation, round pegs may have to fit into square holes. That it's not easy to describe the reality of spirit in the 5-dimensional world that human beings live in. So for instance, in this lecture, Demagnetizing Negative Force Fields, when it was given 40-odd years ago, society in general wasn't as comfortable with the idea of energy. The New Age was still working out the kinks in its communication and its methods and its technologies. And so the idea that there were force fields of energy, the idea that human beings held an auric field, an energetic auric field, the idea that we interact with each other by doing, and I say this lightly because of course I don't know what it looks like, but the idea that we communicate with each other by throwing bolts of energy back and forth between each other, or bioplasmic streamers. The idea that when I think of somebody I love, I am actually in contact with them in the spirit realm, even though I'm here and they're still in the city that they're in. These ideas were fairly novel or new back 40 years ago. And now it's easier to accept them. They've been talked about, they've had so many disciplines talk about it, and you get so many examples that it seems more reasonable than 1 or 2 people saying these things that didn't seem to square with our reality. So in the Demagnetizing Negative Force Fields, the paradigm that I'm getting to is that the guide says that, and this is repeated many, many times, every thought creates a world. Again, imagine that. Every thought, every feeling creates a world. Now, in my mind, I see this this magic bubble blowing machine where every thought and every feeling I have creates a little bubble that floats away, and it's a world. And I just see this as being almost a comedy routine of my creating worlds upon worlds upon worlds, day in and day out, endlessly. And if I'm doing that, and you're doing that, and he's doing that, good grief, how do you have room to work? And yet the guide indicates that there is no lack of space in spirit, that we never get crowded. It doesn't seem to think that we have to slow down. But if every thought and feeling creates a world that in the spirit world you can see and touch and feel and experience, that what this lecture is about is that when we generate negativity, okay, we are generating a force field of negativity. Okay, so however you imagine that to be, whether you're covered with frothy bubbles full of negativity, whether you look like Charles Schultz's cartoon character of Pigpen and you're carrying lice and debris around with you, however you imagine a negative force field, like you're a magnet and you've got a whole bunch of iron filings sticking out like crazy hair from you, that we magnetize negativity to us, and it creates a vortex, a force field, that will in turn generate or attract negative force fields in others. Again, if I simply say that, somebody might say, okay, I'll buy that, and, okay? But it is important for us to get this on a very personal and intimate level. And on a very personal, intimate level, what this looks like, and I'm going to joke about this because it's easier, is I remember when I was a child and I was grumpy, my mother would tease me and call me Little Chief Thundercloud. And if you have that kind of grumpy, miserable persona and you're stomping around, what this lecture basically says is that like attracts like. And instead of inspiring the good witch Glenda to come cheer you up, what you'll inspire is another grumpy person to join forces with you. Because the other grumpy person tends to like the fact that you make them feel normal. And now the two of you can grump around together and feel like you're having companionship. So instead of feeling negative, you can actually feel some companionship in the being grumpy and negative. So this is the kind of force field we're talking about. Another joking way to try to describe it, it's as if we all have little radio towers coming out of our head and we're beaming things out. And if you beam positive, you attract and generate positive. But if you beam negative, you'll attract and you'll beam and attract negative. So you're basically energetically saying that you enjoy and wish to participate in negative activities. And so the opportunity to participate in negativity will come to you. So what the guide is saying in this lecture is that if you are in a space where a lot of negativity is occurring to you, that one way to work on this is to look at how you're generating a negative force field. And then to look at how you can stop that, not abruptly, not artificially, but to find the place in you that is sending out the negative force field and making the adjustment of attitude inside yourself so that you are not sending out this negativity and creating this force field. Then if you choose, or the next step might be to send out a positive force field. But this is not a flipping the switch kind of thing. This is a way of looking inside at your inner attitudes where you are generating this, rather than this happening to you. So the quotes from the lecture, the specific quotes are, every conceivable attitude or concept about life creates such a force field. and the force field of a specific attitude to life is also ruled by laws of attraction. Like attracting like. So when I was talking before about as in heaven, so below, and back and forth, what the guide presents in many other places in the lectures is that the laws of physics, the law of gravity, all the laws of nature that we deal with on this planet, the laws of mathematics, all these sciences that we work with, are in effect a version of spiritual law. That the same thing exists in spiritual law on a much broader, much more extensive level. So that you can take Newtonian physics, and Newtonian physics, gravity, attraction, inertia, momentum, all these terms, is reflected in spiritual law as well. Spiritual law being larger and more expansive than human science. But we shouldn't discard human science. We should perhaps step into it and see a larger picture, or see it from a larger perspective. So, sorry, just trying to get my head straight on the next point. I kind of lined this up in what I thought was a logical sequence of information, but I don't know whether it is or not. So,
sounds like that brings into play the observer self.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So in the place where we're asking you to look at your own involvement in something, what part of you is going to do that? So that's what the observer self can be set up to do. That you can find a part of you, and this is not like one mask or another mask. This is not fragments or pie-shaped segments of consciousness. I think that the observer self is a way of anthropomorphizing, or using words to describe a part of you that is capable of being objective, even under strenuous circumstances. So, for instance, people who are trained to be emergency medical personnel, they're not inhuman. They care about blood, they care about pain, they care about urgency, but they've been trained to go through a certain protocol. And there's a part of them that is holding the need to be scientific and careful about what they do, because that's the best way to deal with an emergency. And yet the part of them that wants to respond to a human being is still active. And some people can't do that. But that would be an example of a profession where the ability to train the objective observer allows you to do something that civilians can't do. Okay? So that's a way of looking at your observer self. That when you find yourself in an emergency, the observer self just stands by and says, let me see, what would be good to do under these circumstances? What is appropriate considering our value system? What is our priority? So a lot of professions use that ability to be objective in the profession itself. So yes, in this work, we need to do the same thing. We need to train part of us to be objective, part of us to be able to stand back out of the emergency and not be overwhelmed by what's going on, but not to be insensitive to what's going on, to not interfere with what needs to be done, but to assist us in keeping our reason, not being rational, but keeping our reason and our reason options open, keeping our emotion options open, and continuing to scan to see if we're taking advantage of everything at hand. So you can think of your objective observer as being like a paramedic or a doctor or an emergency person who will hold that space for you and help you find priorities. So in the paradigm shift, the other thing that it's important to consider, besides the fact that the spirit world might have more dimensions than we do, is that the story as we see it may not be played out in the time period that we have determined is appropriate I'm being very careful with my words here, because what I'm trying to say is, if we think that cause and effect ought to happen within a 1 month period of time, that's our thinking process, that's our intellect, that's our, that's just us and our stuff and our beliefs and our fears. When the actual spiritual beginning, middle, and end of this story could extend over a decade. And what we're seeing is a dramatic point in the story. So it's like you're watching, there's a movie, and you're seeing one scene. And in the one scene, you're not getting the full history of how somebody got here, how you got there. And you're not seeing the full panorama of what's going to happen afterwards. You're seeing the one clip. Now, I
have a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that all we are capable of seeing?
No, I don't believe so. Personally, I think that we can widen our vision. What I'm suggesting is that people aren't used to doing that. That there's a habit. I'm suggesting that people think that cause and effect should show up sooner than, that cause and effect should show up, and the should is based on their needs. Okay?
So how do you separate from that?
Well, by, number one, challenging your own beliefs. Okay, this is where the objective observer can come in. Yes, I think that somebody should get their comeuppance. It's the word that was used in my family, comeuppance.
Yeah.
You will get your comeuppance one day. It's like seeing somebody rob a bank and go to trial and then get off scot-free. Let's just use that as a primitive, cliche example. Okay. People believe that crime should be punished. People believe that guilty people should do whatever they have to do, whether that's go to jail or pay the victim or do whatever it takes. And if we see somebody get off, if we see somebody where they don't get caught, or the trial has a mistake in it and they're let free, it can look like there was no link between cause and effect, that somebody committed a crime but did not receive punishment for it. Okay? But in the spirit world, no crime goes unpunished, and no good deed goes unrewarded. So in the spirit world, this bad karma that this person created is just sitting out there waiting for them, and it could come to pass, it could resolve in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It could also resolve in another lifetime. And that's where, what can we do with that information? So in other words, if we are living today remnants of things we did from another lifetime, and we're not going to complete it in this cycle, and we're going to complete it in another lifetime, how in heaven's name, as an individual human being, are you going to put this story together?
That would be my exact question.
Okay. What the guide says is that there is these the soul movements that I talked about before, dreams, intuition, eros, thoughts, and feelings. These can be guidelines to helping you complete the task that you came here to do, which may only be one segment of a larger story. You're really only here for the one segment, okay? You don't need to know in your conscious mind the entire story. But you can key into that segment and do it so well that you really do have a sense that you're on the right track and you're doing the right thing. And what I'm saying is there is no way to know the absolute truth of the arc of your story. And even if you don't believe in reincarnation, most people believe that there is a spiritual life before a baby is born, and that there is a spiritual life of some kind after death. So whether or not that manifests in human form, it may manifest in other ways, but the arc may still begin before birth and end after death. So what I'm saying, only deal with the pieces you can access. What the guide is saying is that you may have been prevented from accessing some of the pieces for a reason. Okay? So in other words, if you came here to learn about integrity and you have lost your integrity before, you have a feeling of having lost integrity before. So it gives you more impetus to develop integrity. Okay? You don't have to know the precise events of the previous loss of integrity. But that feeling, that urge, that eros, that need to move on areas of integrity, that will enable you to do in this lifetime what you've come here to do. Now, some people are given sight and psychic vision. The guide simply says it isn't necessary. That highly developed spirits may be able to pray and get guidance and do things that the majority of us cannot. But that just accelerates their ability to accomplish their task. It doesn't, the fact that we don't have a fortune teller telling us every day what, past, present, and future, where we've been and where we're going, doesn't mean we can't complete our task. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does, and I'm trying to tie it in to how you originally started your discussion in Like Attract Like. So
okay.
I'm trying to tie those two together.
Okay. So in Like Attracts Like, you have come in with an energy. Okay? And in the lectures, because the guide teaches that reincarnation is what happens, I teach Pathric, so I accept that, that in the setting up of this lifetime, you have brought in certain energies with you. Okay? Those energies were set up to attract other events and other relationships. Okay? So because you have an energy of seeking integrity, if you are resistant to that, you will attract the energy of other people resisting integrity. But if you are trying to move through that blockage and move into integrity, you will tend to attract people who are doing the same thing. Or perhaps who have even gotten there and who recognize your efforts. Okay? So again, you don't have to know the precise details of how you got here and why this is your specific task. But you can take the evidence of what is happening in your life as evidence of where you might be energetically. Now that comes in at the end of this lecture a little bit. Let me find it. Well, I'm going to bookmark that. Okay, but I think I need to go through cause and effect first, or this won't make any sense. So I'm making a note to come back to that. But let me see if adding cause and effect will help here. So on the theme of demagnetizing negative force fields, okay, what happens is that the reason we find ourselves in a morass is because cause and effect have become separated. Now there's a whole beautiful lecture on cause and effect. It's called Commitment, Cause and Effect, and it's Pathric Guide Lecture 196. And it says the same thing, that when cause and effect are separated, there can be confusion. You can do the right thing, but you don't see a positive result from that. And that makes you think that good deeds aren't rewarded. You can do a negative thing and not get caught and think you got away with it, when the effect is going to come around and nip you about 20 years from now. What happens is that in the first case, when you're doing positive energy, if you're putting out positive deeds, let's pick something. Let's say you're doing volunteer work for charity, and you're putting a large amount of effort in, and you really are genuine, it's coming from your heart, you don't expect reimbursement, you do not expect immediate gratification, you're looking to do it from the sake of giving. But after 20 years of giving, what if you feel that you have not attracted reward? And while that may not have been your primary goal, in the back of your mind, it was there. And you wonder, how can somebody give to charity? How can somebody work 20 hours a week for charity and have negative things happen to them? What this lecture is about is using the observer self and going deeper and taking a look at where this could be actually valid. That despite the 20 years of giving service, there was still some negativity going on that thought it could get away with it because it was being counteracted by the 20 years of service. So in the first case, when you do good deeds and you don't see them rewarded, we might put up with that for a day or 2 days or 3 days, but very few people have the strength of character to do good deeds for 20 years with no significant amount of reward, of feeling like they've been validated or seen. The test there from a spiritual standpoint might be, were you doing it because it was right, or were you doing it for reward, even if that reward was, it was okay to delay the reward. It could be a spiritual test for you to have done that and find out that you could not sustain not getting a reward. That eventually you wanted something back for your efforts, and therefore it wasn't a giving, it was actually a barter. Okay? But there's negativity in there. So the whole time you're giving, this little negativity of where's mine is in operation. If what you get back is negativity from life, what the lecture is suggesting is that you go deeper into your own life and you look very, very carefully and you see where you might be responsible, where there might be some negativity in your life that didn't seem obvious, and it certainly seemed counterbalanced by other aspects of your life. But you see, karmically, you can't do that. Karmically, you can't put 3 good things and 1 bad thing on the table and hope that nobody notices the bad thing. Karma is always objective. Spiritual law is impersonal and impartial.
Yeah, I want to interject a little current situation that kind of fits into that, and it shows the overall picture. It's not always that easy. I was making a donation, and I asked for that to be made anonymously, and then the person who agreed to do that was approached by the leader that was receiving the donation, who wanted to know who gave it so they could send a thank you card.
Yeah.
So what do you do in a situation like that? You just say, no, I just don't want my name out there, or what?
So if we take that situation, actually you're asking for what to do, but the work is about looking inwards at yourself and asking if you weren't secretly happy that somebody wanted to eliminate the anonymity request. What I'm saying is that the work that might be done in that situation might be to go in and say, was there a secret place of me where I thought I was being a good person to request anonymity, but I was chafing at it? And somebody also chafed at it, so they offered me an out. They offered me an opportunity to very simply and easily remove the, I'm going to call it a gift of anonymity. Okay? So it can seem like a very...
What was that word? Of anonymity?
Anonymity. Anonymous gift gives you anonymity. Okay, it makes you anonymous. Hope I'm getting these words right. So what I'm saying is that you might have requested that because you felt it was appropriate, and I'm not saying it was a negative thing. But at the moment where somebody says, would you change your mind, and they give you a rational argument for doing so, if your original statement was valid, why would you change it? If their request is reasonable, why would you not consider it? All these things are true. The work is about the secret feelings that only you know about. The work is about the glee you felt when somebody offered to take away anonymity and actually name you, that you might actually have wanted it. So I don't see in your example anything negative or bad or big. And in all honesty, it's not very easy to work with situations that are benign. Okay?
Uh-huh.
So when they're benign, where's the juice? Where do we work? Where's the distorted feeling? So if there isn't a distorted feeling here that you need to figure out, then it's simply a logic argument. Would it help them if they knew the benefactors, you know, what's the pluses, what's the minuses? You make the list on both sides of the page and do what seems appropriate in the moment.
Uh-huh.
But the lectures are focusing on areas of our lives that carry a lot of distortion. That's the distinction. We're not focused on our happy birthday parties. We're not focusing on the things we do well. There's a place where when I teach and when I give sessions, what I try to tell people is that you can do for free. Okay, you don't have to come to a workshop. That's what you do when you sit with your friends. That's what you do with your family. Society is a place where we celebrate the things we do well, where we meet each other and we pat ourselves on the back and we talk about the struggle that we have when there's not really a huge distortion in it. But the spiritual work that Pathwork addresses specifically are the areas where we're a little ashamed to talk about our real motives. So, well, I'm feeling two threads of the discussion here, and sometimes it's perfect because they meet. They haven't met yet, but I'm really expecting them to meet. So one question is about how do we know, and your question is it appropriate to do a specific thing? If I answer your question, it would be, it doesn't seem to matter much what you do. I don't hear a lot of juice in a yes answer or a no answer. But you might know that there is some feeling about one answer versus the other. And if that's in conflict or if it's not in congruity with who you think you are, that's a good place to work. So we're not talking about simple decisions. And maybe this is where this meets up. When we say, how do we know where we came from? One of the answers to that question might be, what does it matter? If we were meant to know, we would have given ourselves the memory. There's several places in the lectures, and there's a lot of ways to paraphrase it, but what it comes down to is your life does not lie. Okay? And the extension of that is that you have everything you need in this lifetime to achieve the spiritual task that you assigned yourself. That may include memory, and it may include forgetting. It may include finding a spiritual teacher, and if it does, you will be attracted and egged on to do that. But if your spiritual task, for all everybody else says, would not be helped or accelerated by a spiritual teacher and would be accelerated by being alone, you may find yourself alone. So where one person is in the group with a spiritual teacher and in a community and very, very happy, and the other person is a hermit, the question would be, how did you get there? Were you following your intuition, your eros? Are you sensing into your spiritual task and that's where it is for the moment? Or did you run away from your spiritual task? You can run away from a spiritual task by involving yourself in a community where certain questions aren't asked. So for all intents and purposes, from the outside it looks like you're in a spiritual community. But only you know that this community never examines this aspect of human nature. And so you may actually be there to hide. Just as much as someone who becomes a hermit and who looks like he's avoiding human contact. They may be hiding, but they may also be creating an isolation that they need in order to find and examine certain levels of personal feeling and spirituality. So in this place, You as an individual, every person on the planet, is the only one who really truly knows whether you make the right decision or the wrong decision, whether you are following your eros or running away from it, whether you are willing to look at yourself or whether you are quite conveniently looking someplace else diligently because you kind of know you're not looking where the issue is. So there's no right or wrong answer to your question about what to do unless certain feelings came up when the question was asked of you. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to assume it did and go on. So, cause and effect. Well, the quote from the lecture is, you set up continuous chains of action and reaction of which you often lose track. That one of the ways to deliberately avoid your own work is to confuse, to obfuscate, to muddy the water so that you can't see what you're doing. Now, I use a lot of movies to teach with because I find that film, like all art forms, reflects the human experience. And one of the best examples of separating cause and effect was the movie Memento. And in the movie, the man had an injury that caused him to lose short-term memory. So he remembered things from before the accident. But after the accident, he could only remember things for 3 to 5 minutes. And so he developed some compensating tools for this. He developed, he would take Polaroid snapshots of something and write down who that person is and what they meant, a sentence or two. And as the movie progresses, he looks like a person who's trying desperately to find justice and find the truth and all that. But as the movie progresses, it comes down to a moment when he realized that if he wrote a lie on the picture, that 5 minutes later he would not remember it was a lie, and he would rely on it from that point forward. And then he writes the lie on the picture. And the movie is a confusing movie because it does flashbacks throughout the whole film, so you've already seen the results of this. You've seen where he chased the wrong person and made the wrong interpretations because he assumed that he had written down the truth because that was his method, to write down the truth. And all he needed to do was one single time to write down a lie. And the magic of the movie is that when he wrote it down, he knew he wouldn't remember it was a lie. So that's a rather stunning and dramatic example of where you can separate cause and effect to a point where you can't put them back together again from a human perspective. For all intents and purposes, the connection is broken. Once you break the apparent connection between cause and effect, then you can pretend that you're not doing negative things. Another example...
Do we do that with our consciousness, or we do it with our unconsciousness?
We do it with our unconsciousness and our consciousness.
How do you do it with consciousness?
Okay, I'm going to do the movie thing again and talk about the picture of Dorian Gray, because it's historical and it's a myth and you might have heard of it. And that movie was about a man who had a portrait painted and made a wish that the portrait would reflect his negativity and let him be forever young. And magic happens in the movie, and that's what happens. So as he becomes a drunkard and a dilettante and a mean and vicious person, he still stays beautiful and young, and the picture becomes hideous. That's, it's a story, I know, but that's a way where we can avoid of our negativity. And I think the reason it is such an all-time classic movie is we recognize that in ourselves. Okay? Now, it was conscious at some point, and then what happens is we forget. And it's as if it sinks into the unconscious and we're simply no longer aware of it. So if you make a conscious attempt to disengage cause and effect, and there's no mechanism that brings it back in your face again, for all intents and purposes, it's permanently disconnected as far as your human life is concerned. However, on a spiritual level, it's not. Again, karma is like an elephant. It's got a long memory. Cannot fool karma. Okay? So, I'm going to repeat this phrase. You set up continuous chains of action and reaction of which you often lose track. Now, the unconscious requires the conscious to do things. So when your unconscious does something, it's got to involve your consciousness at some point. Unconscious by itself with no action doesn't do anything. So when people say, if my unconscious did it, how can I be responsible? You can't. What you can be responsible for is noticing the manifested results. And that's why this lecture is so revered. Because basically what it's saying is cause and effect, that if you've got negativity in your life, you've attracted it. If you can find out how you attracted it, you can stop attracting it. Cause and effect. Now, it may not make the karma thing go back to zero, but you stop accumulating negative karma.
Yeah.
So as you stop accumulating negative and you go back towards positive, positive can be very attractive, and you can whiz into the positive. I think of karma like a credit card. So sometimes it's a savings account, sometimes it's a credit card. So sometimes you owe and sometimes you're storing up. It's not a static thing. There's no perfection to it.
But you made an interesting comment, and that was that if you can find the moment that you were unconscious that caused the separation of cause and effect, that you can't erase the karma, but you can change it from that moment.
Right.
So that's like saying if you can just become conscious.
So the work in becoming conscious, part of the work is looking, paying attention.
Yeah, paying attention.
Noticing. And part of that is that if I have a negative person in my life, instead of saying, that's a problem, that's got to go, this lecture is inviting you to look at it from a different perspective. I invited that person into my life. Ooh, yuck. How do I get them out?
Or situation, or event, or...
By creating a situation where negativity could enter. Now, if you don't find that comfortable, change that to the positive. In the areas of your life that go positive, what if they go positive because you attract positive? You send out positive vibes, and positive vibes come to you. If that is true, why would it not be equally true that if there's negativity in your life, you must have invited it? This is not trying to blame anybody or tell anybody they're bad. It's simply saying there's cause and effect. Now, if you go to a place where you say, but I didn't ask for this, this is where I have found the lectures very positive. So I'm going to make an extreme example. If somebody is born with a very, very difficult disease, and they can't get over it, and they grow up crippled in mind, body, and spirit because of whatever it is, whether that's a hangnail or a missing leg or a skin disease or multiple operations, doesn't really matter because our attitude is what's important. So there's some very happy handicapped people who simply overcome that, and there are some very normal people who are miserable because their hair color is wrong. It's a matter of attitude, how we approach things. But at some point, humans believe, or have believed, it's a common cultural thing in Western Hemisphere, to say, it's not my fault I was born crippled. Now, pathwork changes this paradigm. And this is critical to understanding the pathwork lectures. Pathwork says, you chose to be born with this disease. You volunteered for it. This particular disease was going to send your life in a direction that was going to help you learn a spiritual lesson that you could learn no better way. You asked for it. The fact that it's a heavy burden and it's hard to carry and you're whinging, okay. It's still working because it was divinely inspired. You dreamed this up when you were in spirit and had a lot more resources and intelligence and foresight than you do as a human being. So some wise part of you decided to get born with being short, being diseased, being handicapped, being blind, being 7 feet tall. Some quality that makes life difficult for you. This was a choice. And it was meant to bring you into interaction with certain obstacles. If your attitude to that is positive, even if the results are poor, your attitude will still be, that's okay, we'll just try again. But if your attitude brings you into situations that basically encourage you to think negatively and bitterly, to curse God, to berate your parents for their gene pool, to believe that the doctors did it to you, or society doesn't support. If this is your mindset, you're creating a negative force field around you. And you will attract people who think the same way. So imagine a room full of people who believe it's somebody else's fault. Please understand, I'm not talking about a rational argument to determine what to do and how to deal with it. I'm talking about a blame fest. And if sitting in this pool of blame fest among the colleagues that you attract to you and the friends you attract to you, or even the family you got born to, which may have had a tendency to blame people, and now they've got extra ammunition. Number one, you will probably be met with negativity by others. But underneath that, there's something that it's possible for you to learn. So this lecture is talking about where we are responsible for the negativity in our lives. And again, if you say, but it's just negative and there's nothing I can do about it, that's an attitude. You do control your attitude. So one person may think that being in a wheelchair is negative, but another person may not. It's a personal choice, what we think of life. The person who's in a wheelchair who says, that's too bad, and I'm going to go into the Olympics, or I'm going to do something, is going to attract people who also have a let's win, let's figure it out, let's overcome attitude. And the person in the wheelchair who feels put upon and who feels that they might be bad and who feels that there's a lot of blame running around and they don't want it to come on them, so they're going to push it onto others, that person is going to attract certain energies throughout their life. All the lectures...
Is some of this not fear-based? Does some of it not come from fear?
Yes, and what the lecture is saying is we can control our fear. We are not slaves to fear. Fear is one of the things that you want to look at. Fear is one of the things that you want your objective observer to look at so that you can look at the situation from a more impartial point of view. So fear is simply fear. You can be afraid and get over it, take a few deep breaths, and go on, can't you? I mean,
I see, personally, I see fear as sort of the opposite of love, and that when you were talking before about negativity, just in my own personal sense is that, maybe for me I speak only, that negativity in my own self, I sometimes, more or less, can relate it to operating from a place of fearfulness as opposed from a place of acceptance and love.
Okay, I accept that. What the lecture would say in that case is if that is producing a result that you feel is negative,
yes,
and you want to change,
yes,
then you're going to have to look at the habit of fear.
Yeah.
You're going to have to look at where you find fear comforting. And it can be. When we are fearful, we are consumed with emotion. And that can sometimes muffle details that actually create a lot of anxiety in us. So again, I'm going to exaggerate. This is where a drama queen kind of routine, where somebody gets really upset and throws a really big fit and they may be covering a very small sense of insecurity. But when they go into this drama act, they don't notice the insecurity. So they actually feel better. Even though the drama act may lead them into some negative responses, and it may lead them into destructive behavior, what they're really trying to do is get rid of that nagging feeling of anxiety. What this work is about is very slowly and gently and with love, figuring out that there's something else going on. And slowly and gently with love, kind of peeking underneath the table and seeing what might be possible that we haven't noticed before. And what the guide is saying is the evidence is probably within your grasp. That when you start doing daily review, when you start doing self-analysis, when you start, for instance, when you work with somebody, whether you work with a professional or you work with a group or you work with a friend. My daughter gave me the most wonderful gift one time. She said, a friend is a therapist that you don't pay. And you pay friendship back in different ways. But that speaking to a friend was a kind of therapy. It wasn't a waste of time. It wasn't just giddy. That there was an opportunity there to really talk about your heart with somebody who actually cares about you. And that in that expression, in that exchange, you can find out some things about yourself. You can hear yourself speak. And it's when those words actually hit the air and rebound off another person that you may realize, ooh, that's kind of prejudiced, isn't it? Or, I never realized how selfish that sounded. Or, you know, that sounds a little boastful. I wonder what's going on there.
Sure.
Pardon?
Sure. That's friends, family. Yeah, sure.
So any human being that you interact with has this potential to act as a mirror to you. And you have more ability than you have imagined to find these areas to work on. And I am bookmarking and keeping in mind the questions people ask, and I do very much appreciate them. Because the work is about what you do, not about what anybody says, and not about phrases, and not about bullet points, and not about objective realities. The work that we do in Pathwork is all about a very, very deep subjective reality, where again, in the most wonderful way, you're the only one who knows whether something is a distortion or simply a discomfort. And it is in the exploration of that discomfort where you can either resolve and say, I was just uncomfortable. There was a conflict there, but it's not major. I have looked there, I haven't found any negativity, I haven't found any negative intentionality, and you know, I'm going to let it go. I give up. I'm just going to let go of the fact that I drink too much coffee or I spend too much time with my friends. That's a value judgment. I'll try to get over it, but I can't find a distortion in it. I really think that may be more positive than negative, and I'm going to let it go. Versus another activity that could be just as innocuous and yet hold distortion. By distortion, what we're talking about is a false belief that you will not let go of, a prejudice, a place where you are ready to give up negative behavior except for this one. this negative behavior, that's not negative. This negative behavior is actually positive. Well, that's a distortion. Even in saying that, you ought to be able to see that. But I've been through this myself with my stuff, and you can say it and not get it. And so part of the joy of what the guide presents is congratulations. If you're in distortion and in negativity, it will show up someplace else. You know, you won't be able to keep this to yourself. You won't be able to hide the picture of Dorian Gray. At some point, the two are going to come together, even if you can stall it off for a very, very long time. Okay? So, when I talk about, I'm going to go back to cause and effect for a second. In the place where someone truly does a negative act and truly does not pay a human or society price for it, the idea that they're getting away with something is ludicrous. Because imagine what this soul is going to have to carry in the next lifetime. You don't truly think that if you escape justice in this lifetime, you're off the hook. And if you are so sly and negative and determined to stay negative in this lifetime, you may give yourself a spectacularly difficult task the next time through. And this is where somebody getting away with something could actually be in alignment with their spiritual task. They may need to get away with something on a human level to find out you can't get away with it on a spiritual level. And to find out that the consequences are much, much worse on a spiritual level than if you just spent the jail time. Or if you just gave back the money. Even to the point where if you just told somebody, I'm sorry. That holding these negativities and trying to pretend that they don't exist have far more cumulative affect than the societal price that we are sometimes asked to take as punishment for our negative behavior. Okay? So that's cause and effect. The other topic that's addressed in this lecture, even though it's mild, is resistance. Okay? And this is where the quote is, your life reveals what your underlying beliefs and attitudes must be. It cannot be otherwise. Your life reveals what your underlying beliefs and attitudes must be. It cannot be otherwise. And the short version of that is your life does not lie. Now, when I work with people individually and I work with people in groups, I make two presumptions. Number one, that they're willing to hear this spiritual version, and they're not going to insist, but I didn't get caught, so I'm not guilty. And the second thing I assume is that they feel that there's something not right. Okay. Happy, content people don't try to rush to therapy sessions. That's just not what they do. They have better things to do with their time and their money. Okay? So even if they're not quite ready or able to admit it, anybody who comes into therapy groups, workshops, anybody who comes into this force field that has the potential to heal, not that we heal, but we can facilitate the self-healing of a person. But anybody who's attracted to the force field of self-healing and becoming more conscious, their attraction is because that's what they want. The truth is that that part of them may be very, very tiny, not well developed, sleepy, lazy, so that they try to get on the merry-go-round and they fall off. Okay, and they pick themselves up and they try to get on and they fall off. And at some point they may say, this is ridiculous, the merry-go-round, you should, you know, yap, 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 and they storm off in a huff. Okay? From a spiritual perspective, something happened here. They reached out, they weren't able to get on the bus, they weren't able to get on the merry-go-round, and they decided to continue the way they were continuing. That's one story. Another is that in the reaching out, they also made a decision to change, and that decision to change will continue to be active even though the initial vehicle they chose did not seem appropriate. And this is how I try to understand people who contact me and then never contact me again. That there was something they needed in one lecture or one piece of paper or one phone conversation that would serve their purpose, even though continued conversations and continued work don't seem to be appropriate to their life task. Other people stay longer. When I did this work, I wound up being a pathwork helper. I didn't know that was going to happen. I made this my life work because I love it so much. That's simply another shade in the spectrum. Okay? So, if your life reveals what your underlying beliefs and attitudes must be, if you have an underlying belief and attitude that nobody can help, even if there's a positive part of you that reaches out for help, that negative part of you is going to pull you away. The negative part of you will critique the teacher, critique the group, critique the air conditioning, critique the kind of tea served during breaks. It's going to critique something. It's going to argue with the materials or say it's too much work or too little. Something's going to become a vehicle to justify your pulling out. If you have led a life where one part of you tries to learn and another part of you, and these phrases are just, it's arbitrary, there's no, you're one unified thing, but it feels like you reach out with the left hand for something and the right hand slaps you and pulls back or makes you drop it. That's the place where work can be done. Okay? Something's going on there. If you reach out for something and you get it and bring it in and it becomes integrated with your life and it's all positive, don't worry about it. Probably a positive thing. If you reach out for something and it simply doesn't seem to function and you can't get excited about it, you have no eros for it, and it just falls away from your life and it doesn't seem to bother you, maybe it wasn't important. Maybe that was a rational thought pattern. This might help. When the reality is, your unconscious is telling you, no, it won't help. So while you may not be able to speak directly to your unconscious, the trick is to look at the evidence laying in front of you. So, another phrase from the lecture that says that is that the negative force field can sometimes take the form of an image. I'm setting up the quote, this isn't in the lecture. But there are a lot of pathwork lectures on images, because an image is like a vortex or a force field. If we have an image of ourselves as beautiful, and this is fairly common nowadays, although the way we phrase it may be new agey, it's a fairly well-known thing. Any woman who thinks she's beautiful tends to be perceived as beautiful. Any man who thinks he's handsome tends to be perceived as handsome. And then sometimes you get a still picture of this person and go, whoa, big nose, hairy chin, bad hairline. Why did I ever think this person was attractive? Because their auric field was attractive. Because they were putting out a welcome. They were putting out a pretty, a beautiful, a handsome energy that made you feel good, and you thought it was their visage, you thought it was their face. The contrary thing would be you could have a very physically attractive person who's ugly. And sometimes you can actually see it, and it's almost bizarre that even though the face itself is beautiful, there's an ugliness about it. And that would be the force field that they're surrounding themselves with, that they're emanating or attracting. Understand that whether you attract it or emanate it, it's just, in that moment there may be more putting out than bringing in, but it's the same mechanism. You wouldn't attract it to you if you didn't want it. And you wouldn't emanate it if you didn't want to do that. Okay? So the quote is that the image has to be dissolved. And the creative energy that was locked up in the image is from now on to be utilized in ways that are compatible with the divine law. And one of the things that's in here, it's not expressed well in this particular quote, But part of what the guide is saying is you take that image, you take all that energy and that interaction that you're doing that you're not aware of, and you clean it up. And now you have the ability to use that energy flowing from you and flowing in from others for positive purposes. So in sports, it's called a point swing. So if somebody gains 5 points, I don't quite know how it works, but basically when you stop going into debt and going into savings, that's a huge change. It's not a small change. It's massive. It changes everything. So what the guide is saying is that if you dissolve this image, if you dissolve this force field so it's not operating for the purpose of negativity, and the creative energy, because this took energy. This was hard work to bring all this negativity in. You had to work to shove that negativity out. It's not a passive thing. It doesn't just flow like water out of a spring. That the creative energy that was locked up in the image is from now on can be, I'm going to translate this, can be utilized in ways that are compatible with divine law. You have more time and energy on your hands for the positive because you're no longer spending it.
I mean, if that changes, you should be able to see the change in their circumstances in your life, right?
Yes. I'm going to pause for a second.
You're attracting, if you're observing what you're attracting at different times, maybe you will notice what you perceive as an improvement of what you're attracting as you change.
So if you, I'm going to take that as, yes, if you do a clean transformation, you'll see results. What concerns me sometimes is this is where people use should, and the reality is it has to happen. It's not a should.
Right.
It's absolute. If you're putting out positive energy and you were putting out negative energy, there's a sea change. There's no doubt whatsoever. The trick is there may be reasons why it doesn't manifest in ways that you expect. That's where it gets tricky here. Do you understand?
Yeah, so you're making a judgment about what should be there instead of just allowing the principles to work, huh?
Right. So to some extent, if you have seen the light and you have decided that you were negative and you're now going to be positive, and there's a condition in there, a secret condition, an informal, unwritten contract, and then I'll get rich, right? Well, not necessarily. You may stay poor.
Right.
But poor is not inherently negative. And you always have the choice on how you approach things. Your interpretation is always a matter of attitude rather than circumstance. So any expectation that you put on making this change, spiritual law might decide to challenge you and find out how committed you are by not giving you that expectation. Not getting reinforcement could be another spiritual test coming right after the first one.
I read something, I don't remember whether it was past work or what, but I wrote it down as a thought because it's a sort of an attitude of expectancy, but not expectation.
It might have been, something like that might have been in the lectures, yeah. So expectancy is an openness, whereas expectation is a veiled demand.
Yeah, I never thought of the difference of those two words, but it kind of clarifies things.
Yeah. So the last quote on this resistance part, and the reason I'm listing this under resistance is that if you have an image of yourself and you change the image and you don't get what you expect, you can use that to reinforce the idea that you weren't doing anything wrong in the first place. And this can be part of your resistance, where you're not doing it because you want to, but you will grudgingly do it if you can get a reward out of it. That's really resistance to positive process. Okay, so in this lecture, the quote is, as long as a deliberate negativity a negative intentionality exists in you, the resistance to commune with your eternal spiritual self will be too great. So again, I'm going to go back to why don't murderers come to pathwork therapy sessions? That's not their spiritual path. Okay? The reason you murdered in the first place is part of a huge series of events, and you're obviously headed down a certain path. To murder, normally we justify murdering, or to thief, to steal. We justify stealing. So the thief doesn't feel like he's stolen. He feels like he's balanced out the inequalities of social life. A murderer feels that he was betrayed, or that the other person stole and needs to be given street justice. Okay, we've got a rationale in our head for why this is acceptable morally. Or I had to do it. I couldn't live if you lived, so I killed you so I could live. It's a survival thing. You shouldn't punish me. I was just trying to get along. Okay? As long as there's a commitment to deliberate negativity, a commitment to saying, I don't care about spiritual law, I wanted it my way. I wanted the money, I wanted the power, I wanted this person dead. That's a commitment to negativity. As long as that's there, there will be a resistance for you to go inwards and look at your motives. I know how logical that can be, but sometimes you have to experience it in your own life. So in a place in yourself, and again, I find that the people that I work with, sometimes their negativity is actually really tiny. And they have the privilege of having lives where they have enough to eat, and their rent usually gets paid, and they have clothes, and they have a family, and they have a friends, and something is still nagging at them. And that is a privilege, because it's giving you this enormous support network so that you can burp up some negative quality that might have been too subtle to notice if other things were happening to you. So there are spiritual lessons that can be learned in a life of crisis. Spiritual lessons can be learned in the middle of a war. There is no place where you cannot learn spiritual lessons. But because your life does not lie, the question is, why are circumstances the way they are? How would that support a spiritual task? And what task is in front of you? But if you cling to negativity, if you want your life to be perfect, and say, I really believe that I'm a good person and I live a good life and I should only see good things, so I'm just going to ignore negativity. That's a commitment to negativity. That's not a commitment to looking and cleaning and purifying and transforming. That's some kind of presumption that you're already perfect. And the guide indicates that that's not why we came here. We didn't come here because we were perfect. We came here because there's something that needs to be addressed, that human life is the perfect vehicle to address it with.
So at that moment, are you just supposed to ask for guidance and understanding?
That's one way to address it. A genuine, heartfelt, open prayer to understand usually yields something. Now the trick is you may not see it. Just because your prayer got answered does not mean that you saw it. Okay?
Just because the prayer got answered doesn't mean that you saw it, or you don't see that the prayer gets answered.
So what I'm suggesting is this. You put your heart out and you say, God, I want to learn, I really do. Please allow me to learn. If your perception is that nothing happened, what if nothing happening is a challenge, a test of your own faith?
Yes, also.
Right. Rather than a negative, rather than a punishment or God's busy and he doesn't have time for you today. What if a lack of answer is an invitation? I heard you. Now I'd like to see how much work you're willing to do. And then we'll come up with a plan on helping you out. In other words, what's wrong with the idea that we're being asked to put forward first, instead of having God put forward first?
well, it's not having the expectation of the answer that's supposed to come, I guess.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you're truly, truly open and you ask God for help and you don't get what you perceive as an answer,
yeah,
okay, then the question would be, maybe I'm supposed to do some of this on my own. Let's get started. I've never met anybody who truly asked for help that didn't get any. But I have seen people, you know, and I'm sure you've heard these jokes about when the flood comes and the guy's on his roof and 4 rowboats come by and he keeps saying, no, 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 God will save me. And he drowns and he comes up in front of God. It's a long, shaggy story. And he stands in front of God and says, what's the problem? I was waiting for you. And the guy says, I sent 4 people to save you. What do you want? Okay? That's what I mean by we may believe that God only helps this way. And yet, in a broader sense, we got all kinds of people trying to help us because God has activated them. But we don't perceive it. So there's a place in us where we're not looking. So that what I'm suggesting here is a positive and generous possibility that there's something there that you're not seeing. And how can you support yourself in seeing it? The lectures don't talk about people being bad. Okay, that's not in here. This is not an original sin kind of philosophy. The lectures talk about the fact that for you to get born is a statement of positive intentionality that outweighs everything else that happens. To get born generates and triggers a series of activities that are going to get you learning something. If not everything you imagined, at least something. Everybody wins, nobody loses. From my perspective, people who are attracted to the lectures have some level of excitement. They've kind of gotten this and they want more. And so the lectures are suggesting ways for you to accelerate your spiritual progress. And this lecture talks about one way to accelerate your spiritual process is to find out where you are holding yourself back. So in the places where you are letting out or attracting negativity, work there. Because once you release that energy, look at how much more creative, positive energy you've got to go forward with. Rather than putting blame on this, you're bad, do this penance, etc. Okay? And that's a good segue for me because the next part of this lecture, and some of these lectures are just chockers with subjects, and it's incredible. And you wonder sometimes, how can you teach it? Sometimes you only teach a half a lecture because that's all you can get through. So the next section of the lecture has to do with, and it's in the title, so the original title is Demagnetizing Negative Force Fields, Pain of Guilt, okay? And the guide distinguishes between guilt and remorse. Now keep in mind that the joke is there's a lecture on everything, and so there's already a lecture on real and false guilt. And there's also a wonderful lecture on restitution. Restitution for real guilt. And so these tie in, or the guide is delineating between false guilt that you are using to justify something, to keep you busy someplace else, versus real guilt that needs to be addressed. Okay? Real guilt requires that you do something. If you have hurt someone, and I went, like many people, I went through an emotional 12-step program. It's a 12-step program for codependence. Went through that. And so I love 12-step. I think it's just simply another version of pathwork. And one of the steps in 12-step is making restitution. And what they teach you is you don't have to go to the person that you harmed directly. That may not be possible. That person may not understand. It could cause it's a nice idea. If it is, great. Go apologize in person. But there are other ways to do restitution for the harm that you have actually done. You could write a heartfelt letter. You could find the truth about it so that you weren't holding blame, that you weren't secretly saying, yeah, I did it, but, that kind of thing. You can work on yourself. You can do karmic action in another arena with the specific intent of paying for that guilt. Okay? So, if you are truly guilty of something, then you may need to pay back. But beating yourself up because of your guilt, who does that serve? And it prevents active restitution. So think of people who did something that they consider to be wrong in their youth, and they live a life of public service the rest of their life. Okay, everybody wins on this one. So the whys and wherefores of what they did, it's not that you don't want to hide it, you don't want to minimize it, you don't want to blame somebody else or let somebody else, or let the negativity fester. But you do want to consider whether there is any possibility where you could create true restitution, perhaps beyond the actual guilt that you hold. So basically tithing a little bit more than you need to, so that you really feel the fullness of your desire to do restitution. So there's real guilt and what needs to be done about real guilt. And that includes guilt for pain you have inflicted or are still inflicting. So what this is addressing is you may be sorry, but you may also be continuing to do it. You may be in process of really getting that this is inappropriate, that whatever you're doing negatively shouldn't be done, however you're still engaged with it. That's real guilt. And you need to act on that. You need to do something. Take action with whatever it is. So that's real guilt. Then there's also a quality of getting that you're guilty. So simply paying someone off. So if I wrong you and the accident is worth $100, and I try to run away from it, and I finally say, no, I'm going to clean this up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write you a check for $500, and that's 5 times what the situation's worth. And I hand you the check for $500, but I've never actually absorbed the guilt. I've never actually absorbed my intention to cheat another human being, to claim innocence where there was no innocence, to allow that person to undergo hardship, and to turn away hoping I could get away with it. I haven't really dealt with the pain that I caused, not the guilt, but the pain. So the guide addresses this by saying, remorse deeply feels the pain of wrongdoing, yet never loses sight of your divinity. So there's guilt, there's real guilt, and there's remorse, which deeply feels the pain that you have inflicted. But remorse does not beat you up and make you bad, because you are not bad, you are divine. And that's what the guide means by, that never loses sight of your divinity. And on the other end of the scale, there's false guilt, which you might have false guilt about something because you don't want to address the real guilt. So again, like being overly dramatic about something, you can become hugely guilty about something that isn't really your fault or you couldn't really control. And what you're actually doing is trying to dodge taking responsibility for a smaller piece because it never gets looked at because of all this other stuff. So false guilt can be a way of avoiding the hard reality of what you have done that was wrong, requires restitution, and for which, by rights, you should feel remorse. And remorse is part of restitution. There's a difference between saying, I'm sorry, and really getting that you caused pain in another person's life for selfish reasons. Because if you can get that remorse, it is very likely you wouldn't do it again. Once you can truly feel somebody else's pain, it becomes your pain, you go into the unitive, and you wouldn't hurt anybody again after that.
It seems like it would be almost, remorse would be forthcoming more readily if you were never actually able to say I'm sorry to the person, but that you're thinking about what you should be able to say you're sorry about. That person's not around or is deceased or whatever, but you still feel that remorse rather than more strongly than you would if you were able to say I'm sorry.
That might be true. One of the things about remorse is it wouldn't linger. See, if it lingers, if it lingers, it might be some obsessive way of not really feeling the full pain. Once you've done remorse, what are you going to do after that? Once you have really...
Eventually remorseful, I guess.
Well, what I'm saying is the difference between remorse and a case of false guilt and moping around bemoaning what you've done but not being able to do anything about it is if you've done remorse and you've done restitution and you've done everything you can, okay, and you can't forgive yourself, then you just need to go deeper and find out what that's about. But banging the drum for your sins, okay, that's not really remorse. Remorse should be finite.
Well, the remorse may not linger, but restitution could, huh?
Depends on the restitution.
Yeah.
Okay. But real restitution is an attempt to fully accept, number one, responsibility for what you've done, and secondly, accept the cost of what you've done, even if you have to pay in a different format. So, for instance, using the example, if I hurt somebody's car, if I come into my driveway and bump my neighbor's car, we share a driveway, and I decide that he can't see it on my car and I don't have to fess up, so I don't have to tell him that I hit his car. And this person really gets upset and gets angry and blames whatever that person does. And then I start feeling bad about it. And then I realize, no, that's not a good thing. And I simply write him a check. I haven't really looked at this. I haven't really grasped what I did. I set off a chain event of things. I unleashed negativity into the world by my simple denial, by my refusal to take responsibility for a relatively small thing that I could obviously afford to cover. Okay?
So you're setting yourself up to do it again if the situation occurs.
Yes, if I think that, oh, that was a bad idea, here's a check, now I'm done. And remorse would include really getting that was an inappropriate thing to do. Going down deep and really grasping how that, the list of things that it wasn't. Getting the full taste of my own negativity. And at that point, plus the check, okay, I may have made as much restitution as I can. But for instance, if my neighbor carried a grudge for the next 5 years, one of the ways of doing restitution is by simply swallowing the nonsense that person might give you for the next 5 years. Of saying, I deserved this. I lied to this person. And he knows it. So he's going to vent on me. And I really have no defense. Now you might call a halt to it and say, I appreciate that I was wrong, and I appreciate that I made a mistake, and it was a bad mistake, and I'm very ashamed of it, and I've tried to fix this. But at some point, I need you to stop venting, and so I'm not going to listen. That's different from saying, now you're worse than I am. Can you get the distinction there?
Yeah.
You don't have to be dumped on by somebody because you made a mistake and you attempted to make restitution. But to turn that around so it's their fault at that point is overreaching. So I know this is a little esoteric, but I think I can weave something here. In the example of damaging your neighbor's car, trying to hide it, getting caught, or admitting, and then writing the check, now you have a very, very awkward emotional situation with your neighbor. He knows something about you. He knows that there's a part of you that's a liar and a cheat, even if you eventually fessed up. And that can make you feel shame. And you can wonder sometimes, I wonder if he's told the other neighbor. I wonder if he's told my sister. Because this person's a mean-spirited person, maybe he's telling the whole neighborhood. And then you start looking around, you start becoming paranoid, because it looks like everybody on the street is looking, it turns into a huge deal. Okay? This would be a negative situation, where you could say, I'm just paranoid, and I'm sure that he's done it, and I feel ashamed, and I'm beating myself to death. This is an example of fomenting and generating a whole bunch of drama. And I would guess that the underlying part of that is deep shame about having done it in the first place. A place where that person has never fully come to grips with their own lying and thievery.
And then you could switch, blame the other person by saying that it's his place to forgive.
Right. So what I'm suggesting here is that even in that instance, I can be attracting negativity because of my denial. So deep in me is this little tiny piece of denial, where I think I wasn't that bad. It wasn't that awful. I shouldn't have to endure this. Instead of considering that for, I'm going to use my own words, for a person of my integrity, that was a mortal sin. For a person of my integrity, that was so far off the charts that I need to look at this more deeply. But a person who does look at this as his soul and makes restitution, and if that doesn't feel like enough, give more to your church or give time to charity. But make a conscious intention. I did a bad act. I engaged in negative activity. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was awful. I'm going to make a campaign out of making up for this. I'm going to over-restitute like crazy. I'm going to make absolutely certain that I have made up for this, internally and externally. If somebody really does that from the bottom of their heart, it has not been my experience that they really deal with a lot of negativity about this. Does that mean that the neighbor will shut up? No. But what happens is you don't take it in because you've cleaned yourself. That you know to the... Go ahead.
So you're talking about commission in that way, and I just got to thinking that the sin of omission might be more difficult to what is the word, have remorse for.
Well, it's harder to see sometimes. Okay, and if that's the cause, the effect may not be obvious, and it could get past you. What the Patrick lectures are saying is you're still responsible for your sin of omission.
Say that again?
The Patrick lectures are saying that you are still responsible for your sin of omission, even if you didn't notice it. And what we're saying is, but I didn't notice it. Well, how much work have you spent trying to figure out where this negativity could be coming from? In other words, sometimes a lot of spiritual work is the result of feeling bad about ourselves. We may not go back and fix what made us feel bad about ourselves. You can't change history. But you can put your life on a different track and take it in a different direction from this moment forward. And perhaps that is the spiritual lesson that you're learning, and so you gave yourself a little weakness in integrity so that this event could happen. So you could ignore it for a while saying, I don't understand cause and effect here, I just don't get it. And then you start looking. And even if you don't find it, what if you took in the possibility, I may have done something and not seen it. I'm going to make my life more generous. I'm going to become more involved in I may not have known what I did. I just know that things aren't right. So I'm going to throw myself into positive activity. I'm going to shift my attitude so that it's cleaner, more positive, that I see what I can see. It doesn't really matter. And this goes back to a question in the first hour about what if we don't know what we did. To some degree, it doesn't matter. To some degree, the spiritual journey, the spiritual task can come from a gut sense that we did something. And that's enough. This is not a trial. This is not a place where you have to put forward, but I gave 5 cents here and 10 cents there, and the karmic judge says, yeah, but you did this. And that's not what this is. So in the place where you didn't live up to your own expectations, perhaps what you're going to learn to do is go further than your own expectations. And karmically, you have put more positive light and more positive energy in the world, and it will eventually make up for whatever you did. However, I find that a lot of people, upon self-evaluation and self-review, they can find these things. It's not that hard to find where you created negativity, where you contributed to it. And there's a beautiful phrase in the lectures in the stages of commitment, where one of the questions in stage 2, and stage 2 is about learning to live in community, is, can you, I'm paraphrasing unfortunately, can you see in the mountain of untruth that your brother or sister presents to you the one grain of truth? And what that's about is, if somebody is trying to tell you that something's wrong, they may tell you in a blaming way, they may tell you in a selfish or self-centered way, they may tell you with an agenda attached to it. That's their stuff. Okay? Your job can be a way to hear all that stuff and not be activated, to not react to it, to not take the bait of getting into an argument, and to listen for what might be an element of truth in that actually means something and can help you become a better person. So at the bottom of this giant mound of criticism could be something that you could work with. And what stage 2 is about is a way of saying that in community we are not perfect and we may present information to you imperfectly. Are you willing to look for the grain of truth in what is said, rather than focus on the mountain of untruth? That's what this work is about. When we are demagnetizing negative force fields, it's not like we're on a charging horse, charging off to destroy a village. That's just not what our lives are like anymore. The negative force fields that we surround ourselves can be criticizing authority figures and generating a sense of rebelliousness, not grounded in fact, but because we're angry. There's negativity in that. So in the demagnetizing of this, where we allow these images to dissolve, we still retain the possibility that our leaders are not perfect. We still have a case-by-case argument on specific items. We still have an opinion. We still vote in certain ways. But we're not trying to paint them as the all evil, all terrible, all awful thing. We're trying to see them as imperfect human beings that hold a truth, but the way they're enacting the untruth doesn't work for us. But again, by holding a negative force field of all leaders are wrong and all politicians are scoundrels and you really need to goose the system and not pay your parking tickets and go on strike, this is not a positive approach. This is not going to build a community. This is not going to... Yeah.
How, it seems like it's apropos, how do you
confusion here. One is I heard the feeling of overwhelm, and the other was the technicality of being asked by a number of people, and you probably can't meet all their expectations. Okay, I want to separate these two. One is fact, that you will probably not be able to meet the requests of all charities who are soliciting donations. Okay?
Well, you might be able to, but you'd be broke.
Well, what I'm saying, you're not able to. You're not realistically able to.
Right.
So choices need to be made. Okay? That's a simple fact. And it's not for me to answer on that one, but the simple reality is that most of us choose a number and type of charity and an amount to donate that is comfortable for us, and that's where we sit with until we feel uncomfortable about it. But I wanted to segregate out a place of feeling overwhelmed. That has nothing to do with the charity requests. The charity requests are the trigger. But overwhelm is a reaction. Okay? And overwhelm would come from a place deep in your childhood where perhaps too many requests were made of you. And in defense, you might have pulled away from all of them.
Not knowing which ones to honor.
Right. Now, as a child, there's validity there. You might not have known how to balance, and you might not have known how to say no, and you might not have known how to prioritize. Okay? And yet that sense of overwhelm comes forward in life and attaches itself to something that, and I don't mean to demean your question in any way whatsoever, what to somebody else is a very simple, straightforward question. I pick a charity and that's it. The rest of you have to go look someplace else. The kind of person who can say that quickly and easily, stand with it, and that's their attitude for 20 years, simply doesn't have a childhood drama around being overwhelmed. Okay? But someone who, for 20 years, has never quite been able to figure this out, the thing itself, the charity requests themselves, are a way to draw up this childhood conflict. What I'm suggesting is, in this work, what we're suggesting is that we go backwards and we look at the childhood conflict and help resolve that. Then when we come forward in time, charity requests are simply charity requests. Okay?
Oh, a lot of them have hooks, like they send you name labels, and they put a nickel in or a dime in, or I even got a blanket from an Indian organization.
Yes, but the truth is that when people ask more of us than we can give, there are usually hooks in that too. Okay? So charities are just a manifestation of certain human things. So here's what I'm going to suggest. This sounds like a really rich place for you to work, actually. So this is a really good example of demagnetizing negative force fields.
Say that again?
This sounds like a really good, simple place to practice this lecture. Okay? What I am hearing, and I'm only using this as a suggestion, so it may not work, that there's a place where a lot of requests are coming in, and it's disturbing your system. In the disturbing of your system, I don't feel a positive result. Okay? I'm not hearing that you've made a positive decision, that you've seen the light and you now know what to do, and isn't it great that all those requests have led me to a new understanding? I'm not hearing that.
Well, it's not there.
I got it. So that's why I'm saying that that's why I'm saying that as just a very, very mild, simple exercise.
Okay.
You might be able to take this lecture and look at the situation and see where you are in negative space with this. And I would call withdrawal and a sense of incapacity to engage negative.
Uh-huh.
Okay? then you take a look at what is that attitude? Why don't you feel like you can simply prioritize, pick, and tell the other people, I'm so sorry? That this is a place, from such a simple place as getting charity requests, you could come to a place of doing deep personal work. It may not be totally in line with this lecture.
Well, the way I've been dealing with, of course, just to let those things build up and kind of ignore them, so well, I'll do something about it later, you know?
Right. Uh-huh. Well, did that work?
No.
Okay.
I wouldn't have brought it up.
Okay. So the trick is, if it had worked, it wouldn't be a question. So it didn't work. So let's try something else. Okay. So because we're getting very close to the end, there is a wonderful. So I'm going to switch to something real quick, Carrie, because I think we've touched on that, but I don't think that can be resolved here. Okay?
Right.
So I'm hoping this will tie the lecture pieces together. There is the New Age thing of affirmations. Okay? There is a positive to affirmations, and yet there's a place where they don't work. Okay, now if they work for you, great. You're one of the it works people, so congratulations and let it go. But for those of us who simply look in the mirror every day saying, I wish to be thin and beautiful, and it doesn't happen, we need to look at the possibility that we're not fully on board with this. So when you try to address a problem and it doesn't work, okay, that's when there's something else in there. There's some underlying belief that hasn't been addressed yet. And the words themselves will not resolve the issue. Okay?
The word what?
The words themselves.
Themselves?
Right. In other words, what I'm saying, here's the quote from the lecture that's in 201. It is the thought that must change first.
Right.
In thought lies the intent. This intent can then seep deeper and deeper into the still resisting layers of your consciousness. What I want to point out here is the guide, what we work with in pathwork is the resisting layers of our consciousness. We are dealing with our own resistance. If there isn't any resistance, there isn't a problem.
Right.
If there's a problem, then there's a resistant layer in your consciousness, a place of conflict that you haven't resolved, where you're withholding, you're acting out, something's not working on a positive level. But to address that, we need to get at the thought first. And a simple affirmation isn't powerful enough to change all those underlying layers.
Right.
And yet the guide gives, there's 3 or 4 times in the lectures, the guide gives a, here, try this. And they're really gorgeous. They're really wonderful things. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and close by reading this positive affirmation from the lecture. And what I notice about this affirmation is that it is intended to be an open-hearted request for personal strength and perseverance and the ability to see. Not magic to be sprinkled on your head. And not for somebody else to do it for you. And not even for somebody else to give you strength. But a deep prayer for greater consciousness. And these are the prayers that I'm suggesting get answered. That if you pray for deeper consciousness, I want to say you're going to get it, but I would have to know that that was a genuine prayer, because if it's not genuine, you won't get it. Okay? Or if it's not genuine, you'll get it and you won't see it. It has not been my experience that when I genuinely, honestly ask for the strength to address an issue, that I didn't feel that I felt that I got strength when I asked for it. I felt that I got insight when I asked for it. And that I got greater consciousness. I got an aha. I got a better sense of what was going on when I asked for it. So here's the meditation. We'll use this to close. Okay? I do not want to stay in this position. There are powers within me that make it possible for me to change and feel good and secure about the change. I do deserve it. This change is my birthright. I claim this birthright. I can subsist on good feelings. I can sustain them. I can endure them, just as I can endure pain or disappointment. I now decide to no longer believe in the fallacy that either pain or good feelings cannot be borne by me. If there are any areas within me where I still battle and defend against either the painful or the love feelings, the giving and receiving of love, the power in me can make me conscious of it and can help me lift myself out of the groove that has been set by the force field of this attitude and bring a new force field into being. I pray for the power, the belief, the faith, and the volition to be totally committed to living my life in a good, in a deeply feeling, in an honest way. What the guide is suggesting is that you can say this, and then you may need to know where you're not fully on board. And that's an area for self-examination. In the self-examination, you may free yourself from a place of resistance. And then you come back and say this again, another place that feels stuck or resistant, and you work on that. A very, very good pathwork teacher, Carolyn Tylov, teaches how to read the lectures, and she says, read the lectures until you come to a glitch where you disagree. Stop there, read no more. And the example that she gave when she was teaching was she said, very often when I'm reading a lecture and I read "Greetings, my dear friends," that's it. I can't even read the lecture because I'm stalled right there. I'm not in the mood for "Greetings, my dear friends." I'm arguing with that from the get-go. So my spiritual practice, she teaches, is to allow that to be where I spend my time, working on why "Greetings, my dearest friend" created an internal argument with me. When I can resolve that, then I can go on. But pushing past that and going on, I'm in resistance and I'm not recognizing it. And reading the lecture may not achieve what I think it will. And I think that encapsulates this lecture. That's all it's saying. That if there's a negative force field, we need to address it. We need to bring ourselves to it. We need to look at what goes on. We need to dissolve this negative force field rather than shove past it as if by shoving past it, it won't exist.
Love, be still and know that I am God, that I am with you. Be still and feel that I am real in every light, in every shadow. Be still and know. But since you said goodbye and wandered off through the dark and forgot your